200,000 years ago, a small band of anatomically modern humans walked across the plains of East Africa, and nothing about them looked destined to reshape the surface of an entire planet. They had no cities, no writing, no metal tools, nothing but fire, stone, language, and each other. And yet somewhere inside that fragile, wandering population was the seed of everything that would come after. The pyramids, the printing press, the moon landing, the internet. This is the story of how a single species of ape over the course of a few 100,000 years built and rebuilt civilization again and again, in valley after valley, continent after continent, until the whole planet was wrapped in the invisible architecture of human society. For most of our existence, we were not civilized in any sense we'd recognize today. For well over 150,000 years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, moving in small bands of a few dozen people, following animal herds, following the seasons, following rivers. There were no permanent settlements, no surplus food to store, no leaders beyond the practical authority of the most skilled hunter or the most respected elder. And yet, even in this deep prehistory, the essential ingredients of civilization were already forming. Language let humans coordinate in ways no other animal could, planning a hunt days in advance, warning each other of danger passing down. Accumulated knowledge from one generation to the next. Around 40,000 years ago, something shifted, an explosion of creativity that archaeologists still debate the causes of. Cave paintings appeared in France and Spain. Intricate, skillful renderings of bison and horses. Carved figurines appeared across Europe and Asia. Humans began burying their dead with ornaments and tools, suggesting belief in something beyond the physical world, perhaps the first hint of religion, or at least the first hint of meaning-making, the uniquely human habit of looking at the world and asking what it means. Then, around 12,000 years ago, came the change that made everything else possible. The last ice age was ending. Glaciers that had locked up huge portions of the planet's water were retreating, and the climate was warming into a long, unusually stable period we now call the Holocene. In the hills of the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land running through modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and the Levant, small groups of people who had always gathered wild wheat and barley began doing something new. They started planting seeds deliberately, tending them, harvesting them, saving some for the next season. Agriculture had begun, not as a single sudden invention, but as a slow, almost accidental drift from foraging into farming, one that occurred independently in multiple places around the world within a few thousand years of each other. In the Fertile Crescent with wheat and barley, in China with rice and millet, in Mesoamerica with maize, in the Andes with potatoes, in New Guinea with taro and bananas. Humanity, scattered across the planet with no contact between these regions, arrived at the same revolutionary idea again and again, as if agriculture were less an invention than an inevitability once the climate allowed it. Farming changed everything about how humans lived, and not always for the better. Skeletal remains from early farming societies often show worse nutrition and more disease than those of the hunter-gatherers who came before them, because a diet based on one or two staple crops is far less balanced than one drawn from dozens of wild foods, and because living in permanent settlements next to domesticated animals for the first time exposed humans to entirely new categories of disease, jumping from livestock into human populations. But farming also produced something hunting and gathering never could: surplus. A field of grain, properly managed, could produce more food than the people who planted it could eat in a season, and surplus changed the entire logic of human society. If you don't have to spend every waking hour finding food, some people can specialize instead, becoming potters, weavers, toolmakers, priests, soldiers, and rulers. Surplus also meant something needed guarding, and something worth guarding is something worth fighting over, planting the seeds, quite literally, of organized warfare, private property, and social hierarchy, forces that would define the next 12,000 years of human history. Out of this surplus came the first cities. Around 6,000 years ago, in the marshy floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq, the Sumerians built settlements that grew into something genuinely new in human history. Cities with tens of thousands of residents, organized under centralized authority, built around monumental temples called ziggurats that towered over the flat landscape as visible symbols of both religious devotion and political power. Uruk, one of the earliest and largest of these cities, may have housed as many as 50,000 people at its peak, an almost unimaginable concentration of humanity for a species that had spent nearly its entire existence in bands of a few dozen. And it was here in Sumer, driven by the mundane but essential need to track grain stores, tax payments, and trade transactions, that humans invented writing. The earliest cuneiform tablets aren't epic poetry or philosophical treatises. They're inventory lists, records of barley and livestock, receipts, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. Civilization's first written words were, in essence, bureaucratic paperwork, And yet the paperwork changed the trajectory of the species forever, because for the first time, knowledge could outlive the person who possessed it, passed down not through fallible memory, but through a physical, durable record. Sumer wasn't alone. Along the Nile River in Egypt, a strikingly similar process was unfolding at nearly the same time, though shaped by very different geography. Where Mesopotamia's rivers flooded unpredictably, sometimes catastrophically, the Nile flooded on a reliable annual schedule, depositing a fresh layer of fertile black silt across the surrounding farmland every single year like clockwork. That predictability allowed Egyptian civilization to develop a remarkably stable, long-lasting political structure centered on the pharaoh, a ruler considered not merely a king, but a living god, the human embodiment of divine order itself. Egyptian civilization would go on to last in various forms for roughly 3,000 years, building the pyramids at Giza as royal tombs so massive and precisely engineered that they remain the tallest human-made structures on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, a record unbroken until the construction of medieval European cathedrals. Further east, along the Indus River in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, another civilization was rising, one that in some ways outpaced its Mesopotamian and Egyptian contemporaries in urban planning. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were laid out on precise grid systems with sophisticated drainage networks, standardized brick sizes used across the entire civilization, and public baths, suggesting organized communal life, all built roughly 4,500 years ago. And yet, the Indus Valley civilization remains one of history's great mysteries because its written script has never been deciphered. We can walk their streets, examine their plumbing, admire their craftsmanship, and still have almost no idea what they called themselves, who ruled them, or what they believed, a haunting reminder of how much of the human past has simply vanished into silence. And in East Asia, along the Yellow River, Chinese civilization was taking its own distinct shape, eventually consolidating under dynasties that would give China one of the longest continuous cultural traditions on Earth, one whose writing system, remarkably, remains recognizably connected to its ancient roots even today, unlike the scripts of Sumer and Egypt, which fell entirely out of use and had to be painstakingly deciphered by archaeologists thousands of years later. Across the ocean, entirely disconnected from any of this, civilizations were rising in the Americas on their own independent timeline. The Olmec, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, built the first major cities in the region roughly 3,000 years ago, carving colossal stone heads whose exact purpose still isn't fully understood. Their innovations, including an early calendar system and possibly the first ballgame play courts in the Americas, would ripple forward through later cultures, the Maya, with their extraordinarily precise astronomical calculations and a written script now largely deciphered. And centuries afterward, the Aztec, who built their capital city, Tenochtitlan, on an island in the middle of a lake, connected to the mainland by causeways, a city so large and so meticulously planned that Spanish conquistadors who first saw it compared it in genuine astonishment to the greatest cities of Europe. Meanwhile, high in the Andes, mountains of South America, the Inca built an empire without writing as we'd recognize it, without the wheel for transportation, and without draft animals larger than the llama, and yet still managed to construct a road network spanning tens of thousands of kilometers across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, administered through an extraordinary system of knotted cords called the quipu that encoded numerical and possibly even narrative information in patterns of knots and colors that scholars are still working to fully understand. Back in the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, the millennia between roughly 1500 BCE and the birth of Christ saw an extraordinary acceleration of political and intellectual complexity. Empires rose and fell with increasing speed and increasing scale. The Assyrians built one of history's first great military empires, ruling through a combination of engineering prowess, a genuinely brutal reputation for punishing rebellion, and one of the earliest organized library systems, assembled by King Ashurbanipal, that preserved thousands of clay tablets of literature, science, and mythology, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, arguably the oldest great work of literature in human history. The Persians, under Cyrus the Great and his successors, built an empire stretching from Egypt to the borders of India, remarkable not just for its size, but for its relatively tolerant approach to the diverse cultures and religions it absorbed, and administrative innovation nearly as important as any battle it won. And in a small, rocky, resource-poor corner of the Mediterranean, Greek city-states were experimenting with something almost entirely new in organized human governance, the idea that political power might not belong to a king or a god-emperor at all, but to the citizens themselves. Athens, in the 5th century BCE, developed a form of direct democracy in which free male citizens voted directly on laws and policies, a radical departure from every major civilization that had come before it. Even though that democracy excluded women, enslaved people, and foreigners, and would today look deeply limited by modern standards. Greek civilization, in the same narrow window of time, produced philosophy. In the form we still recognize, with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle asking foundational questions about ethics, knowledge, and the nature of reality that philosophers are, quite literally, still debating today. Greek. Mathematicians like Euclid and Pythagoras built the geometric foundations still taught in classrooms worldwide. And Greek playwrights invented dramatic tragedy and comedy as art forms that continue to shape storytelling more than 2,000 years later. Alexander the Great, tutored as a young man by Aristotle himself, would go on to conquer an empire stretching from Greece to the edge of India before his death at just 32. And in doing so, scattered Greek language, art, and philosophy across the ancient world, fusing it with Persian, Egyptian, and Central Asian traditions in a cultural blending that historians call the Hellenistic period, a preview of the kind of global cultural exchange that would take on far greater scale 2,000 years later. Then came Rome. What began as a small city-state on the Italian peninsula would, over the course of several centuries, grow into an empire encircling the entire Mediterranean Sea, stretching from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. Rome's genius wasn't primarily military, though its legions were formidable. It was administrative and infrastructural. Roman engineers built roads so well constructed that some remain usable today, 2,000 years later. Roman law established legal principles, like the presumption of innocence and the idea of a contract, that still underpin modern legal systems around the world. Roman aqueducts carried fresh water across staggering distances using nothing but gravity and precise engineering. And in the year 380, the empire adopted Christianity, a religion that had begun 3.5 centuries earlier as a small persecuted sect following an executed preacher in a minor Roman province as its official state religion, ensuring that this once marginal faith would go on to become one of the most influential belief systems in human history. Rome's fall in the West, conventionally dated to 476 CE, when the last Western Roman emperor was deposed, didn't happen in a single dramatic collapse. It was a slow unraveling, stretched across generations, driven by economic strain, political instability, and pressure from migrating peoples along the empire's northern frontiers. In the aftermath, Western Europe fragmented into smaller, often warring kingdoms, entering a period long dismissively labeled the Dark Ages. Though modern historians increasingly reject that label as an oversimplification, learning didn't vanish. It survived and even flourished in monasteries, where monks painstakingly copied ancient texts by hand, preserving classical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost entirely. And crucially, civilization did not collapse everywhere. While Western Europe fragmented, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, centered on the magnificent city of Constantinople, endured for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire, preserving Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology in an unbroken continuous thread. Further east and south, an entirely new civilization was rapidly transforming the world. In the 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad united the tribes of Arabia under the new religion of Islam, and within just a century of his death, Islamic armies and administrators had built an empire stretching from Spain to the borders of India, one of the fastest territorial expansions in human history. But the Islamic Golden Age that followed was defined less by conquest than by an extraordinary flourishing of scholarship. In cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, scholars translated and preserved Greek, Persian, and Indian texts that might otherwise have been lost, while simultaneously advancing mathematics, inventing algebra as a formal discipline, refining astronomy, pioneering medicine with hospitals that trained physicians using systematic clinical observation, and developing optics, chemistry, and engineering far beyond what contemporary Europe had achieved. Much of the classical Greek knowledge that would later fuel the European Renaissance survived specifically because Islamic scholars had preserved, translated, and expanded upon it during the centuries when Western Europe had largely lost access to that heritage. Meanwhile, in China, dynasty followed dynasty, each contributing its own extraordinary innovations to human civilization. The Han Dynasty formalized the imperial bureaucracy and extended the Silk Road trade routes connecting China to Central Asia, Persia, and eventually the Mediterranean world. The Tang and Song dynasties that followed centuries later presided over periods of extraordinary technological and cultural achievement, inventing paper, gunpowder, the compass, and printing, technologies that would eventually transform the entire world, though it would take centuries for some of them to travel westward along those same trade routes. Chinese civilization also developed one of history's most sophisticated meritocratic government systems, with the imperial examination system theoretically allowing men of talent from humble backgrounds to rise to positions of significant political power through rigorous testing on classical texts and philosophy. an idea genuinely radical for its time and one that predates comparable meritocratic systems in Europe by well over 1,000 years. And, across the vast grasslands of Central Asia, a different kind of civilization was taking shape, one built not around cities and farmland, but around horses, mobility, and military organization. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes and built, within a single lifetime, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching at its peak from Korea to Eastern Europe. Mongol conquest was, without question, catastrophically violent, responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people. But the resulting Mongol peace, once conquest gave way to administration, briefly connected East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe into a single vast trading network more thoroughly than at any previous point in human history, accelerating the exchange of goods, technologies, and even diseases across the length of Eurasia, setting the stage, tragically, for the devastating spread of the bubonic plague a century later, a pandemic that would kill somewhere between a third and half of Europe's entire population within just a few years. The Black Death, horrific as it was, inadvertently helped reshape European society in ways that set the stage for the next great transformation. With so much of the labor force dead, surviving peasants and workers found themselves with unprecedented bargaining power, gradually eroding the rigid feudal system that had structured European life for centuries. Combined with renewed contact with preserved classical knowledge flowing back from the Islamic world, and wealth accumulating in increasingly powerful merchant city-states like Florence and Venice, the conditions were forming for the European Renaissance, a cultural rebirth centered on renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman learning, combined with genuinely new innovations in art, science, and philosophy. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and later scientists like Galileo and Copernicus began challenging inherited assumptions about art, anatomy, and the very structure of the universe, with Copernicus's proposal that the Earth orbited the Sun, rather than the reverse, representing one of the most profound shifts in human understanding of our place in the cosmos. And then, in 1440s Germany, Johannes Gutenberg adapted existing technology into a printing press using movable metal type, and the effect on human civilization was almost immediate and utterly transformative. Books, which had once been rare, expensive, copied objects accessible only to the wealthy and the clergy, could now be mass-produced. Literacy rates began climbing across Europe. Ideas that had once spread at the speed of a single traveling monk now spread at the speed of an entire printing operation, feeding directly into the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church spread across Europe in printed pamphlets far faster than church authorities could possibly suppress it, permanently fracturing Western Christianity and, with it, the political order of an entire continent. At almost precisely the same historical moment, European sailors, driven by the desire for direct trade routes to the spice-rich lands of Asia, and equipped with navigational innovations partly inherited from Islamic and Chinese sources, began pushing out into open ocean. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain while searching for a westward route to Asia, instead encountered the Americas, a landmass entirely unknown to Europeans and entirely disconnected from Afro-Eurasian history for over 10,000 years. What followed was one of the most consequential, and for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, catastrophic events in human history. European diseases like smallpox, to which Native American populations had no immunity whatsoever, killed an almost unimaginable percentage of the indigenous population, by some estimates as much as 90% across the Americas within just a few generations, a demographic collapse with no real parallel anywhere else in recorded history. European colonization, conquest, and the transatlantic slave trade that followed reshaped the Americas, Africa, and Europe alike, forcibly displacing millions of enslaved Africans across the ocean and permanently intertwining the histories of four continents in ways defined by extraordinary violence, exploitation, and, eventually, an irreversible mixing of cultures, crops, animals, and peoples that historians now call the Columbian Exchange, a transformation so significant that it introduced potatoes and maize to Europe, horses and wheat to the Americas, and reshaped diets, economies, and populations on every continent it touched. Over the following centuries, European powers built vast colonial empires spanning the globe, extracting wealth and resources from Asia, Africa, and the Americas on a scale that fundamentally reordered global power. That extracted wealth, combined with new scientific understanding emerging from the era historians call the Scientific Revolution, when figures like Isaac Newton formalized the laws of motion and gravity that would underpin physics and engineering for the next several centuries, helped set the stage for one final world-altering transformation, the Industrial Revolution. Beginning in Britain in the late 18th century, The Industrial Revolution replaced human and animal muscle power with machines driven first by water, then increasingly by coal-fired steam engines, transforming how goods were manufactured, how people traveled, and ultimately how humans related to time, work, and each other. Textile production, once slow, laborious, hand-based work, was mechanized in factories that could outproduce hundreds of individual weavers. Steam-powered locomotives and ships shrank the effective size of the entire planet, making journeys that once took months achievable in days. Cities exploded in population as rural workers migrated toward new industrial centers, seeking factory work, often under brutal, dangerous conditions that would eventually spark labor movements demanding basic protections like limits on working hours and prohibitions on child labor. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how things were made. It fundamentally rewired the structure of human society itself, creating an urban industrial working class and a wealthy factory-owning class whose tensions would shape political movements, including socialism and eventually communism, for the next 2 centuries. The 19th and 20th centuries compressed an almost dizzying amount of additional transformation into an incredibly short span of time relative to the whole of human history. Electricity, telegraphs, and eventually telephones collapsed. Communication delays that had once taken weeks into mere seconds. The germ theory of disease, established in the mid to late 19th century by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, transformed medicine from a largely guesswork practice into something grounded in genuine scientific understanding, and combined with improved sanitation and eventually antibiotics discovered in the 20th century, dramatically extended average human lifespan across virtually the entire planet. But the same century that brought unprecedented scientific and technological progress also brought unprecedented industrialized violence. The First World War, triggered by a complex web of alliances and nationalist tensions across Europe, introduced mechanized warfare, machine guns, poison, gas, and tanks to a continent still fighting with tactics barely updated from previous centuries, resulting in casualties on a scale never before witnessed in human history. Barely 2 decades later, the Second World War expanded that devastation to a genuinely global scale, encompassing the systematic, industrialized genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others during the Holocaust, and ending with the first and only use of nuclear weapons in armed conflict, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, instantly demonstrating a level of destructive power humanity had never previously possessed, and could now, for the first time in its history, potentially use to end civilization itself. The decades following the Second World War brought a very different kind of transformation, in some ways as significant as anything that came before. Former colonies across Asia and Africa achieved independence from European colonial powers throughout the mid-20th century, reshaping the political map of the entire planet. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union defined global politics for nearly half a century, a tense standoff between 2 competing visions of economic and political organization that never erupted into direct war between the 2 superpowers, but fueled numerous proxy conflicts around the world and drove a technological competition that put human beings on the surface of the moon in 1969, arguably the single most audacious engineering achievement in the entire history of our species. And then came the final transformation, still very much ongoing today, the digital revolution, the invention of the transistor in the mid-20th century, followed by the integrated circuit and eventually the microprocessor, made computing power cheaper and more compact at an almost exponential rate for decades. What began as room-sized machines used by governments and universities became personal computers, sitting on individual desks by the 1980s. Then, internet-connected devices carried in every pocket by the early 21st century. Billions of humans, for the first time in the history of our species, are now connected in something approaching real time, able to communicate, trade, learn, and organize across distances that would have taken months to cross on foot or horseback just a few centuries ago. Artificial intelligence, the technology behind the very words you're hearing narrated right now, represents perhaps the newest chapter in this unbroken 200,000-year story, one whose ultimate significance, like so many turning points in this history, likely won't be fully understood by the generation living through it. Look back across the whole sweep of it, from the first small band of humans walking across the African savanna to a species now capable of splitting atoms, decoding its own genetic code, and building machines that can think and speak. Every civilization covered in this story, Sumerian, Egyptian, Indus, Chinese, Greek, Roman, Islamic, Mongol, European, and countless others left unmentioned simply for lack of time, but believed, in its own moment, that its way of organizing human life was permanent, natural, inevitable. Every single one of them was wrong, Empires that once seemed eternal crumbled into ruins visited today only by tourists and archaeologists. Technologies once considered miraculous became obsolete, replaced by innovations their inventors couldn't have imagined. And yet something has persisted through every collapse, every plague, every war, every revolution. The underlying human drive to build, to record, to pass knowledge forward, to organize larger and larger groups of strangers into cooperative societies capable of achievements no single person could ever accomplish alone. That drive carried us from mud brick temples in Mesopotamia to steel skyscrapers, from clay tablets to satellites orbiting the Earth, from small bands of a few dozen related individuals to a single interconnected global civilization of more than 8 billion people. Whatever comes. Next in this story, and something always comes next, it will be written by the same restless, inventive, deeply flawed, and remarkably resilient species that has been writing it, in one form or another, for 200,000 years.